Is Patriarch Kirill of Moscow simply Vladimir Putin's churchman, a spiritual figurehead doing the Kremlin's bidding? That's a striking charge, and it's been repeated widely in the media and commentary since 2014 and again after 2022. But the answer is not a yes-no headline. And today what I'd like to do is talk you through about the man, his office, his historical background, the Soviet-era precedent of the parallel Synod, and both the strongest arguments for and against the claim that Kirill is controlled by the Kremlin. By the end, I'll explain why I think the reality is more complicated and why declaring simple control paints with too broad a brush. I want to start off with just who is Patriarch Kirill. Patriarch Kirill was born Vladimir Mikhailovich Gudinev in Leningrad on November 20th, 1946. He trained at the Leningrad Theological Seminary and Academy and rose through the clerical ranks in the late Soviet and post-Soviet church. From 1989 until 2009, he led the church's Department for External Church Relations, in effect, the Russian Church's Foreign Relations Office, and was a permanent member of the Holy Synod. In December 2008, he became locus tenens upon Patriarch Alexei II's death, and on 27 January 2009, he was elected Patriarch by the local council. He was enthroned on February 1st, 2009. Those are the basic facts of biography and office. The Department for External Church Relations role was critical. It made him the church's public and diplomatic face for 2 decades prior to his election and gave him relationships across the world of Orthodox churches, states, and interreligious forums. Now, how does he get the job as Patriarch? A quick note about eschatological and process. The Patriarch of Moscow is elected by a local council of bishops, clergies, monastics, and lay delegates of the Russian Orthodox Church. Canonically, the Patriarch is the first among the Russian bishops. He presides over the Holy Synod and has certain administrative prerogatives, but he's not an autocrat in the sense of unilateral executive power. He's not like the Bishop of Rome. The Russian Church is governed by a synod and by a range of synodal departments. In practice, the Patriarch plays a very large role in shaping policy, appointments, and public posture because of his prestige and administrative reach. The Patriarch's accountability is to the Church's canonical structures, the Holy Synod, and the local council, rather than to any secular leader in principle. In practice, however, the institutional relationship between church and state in Russia has long been close and politically consequential. So let's outline the case critics make when they say Patriarch Kirill is controlled by President Vladimir Putin. These are the most common points. There's the public political alignment. Since at least 2014, Kirill's public rhetoric has often framed Russia's geopolitical posture in civilizational or spiritual terms, and he has rarely criticized Kremlin policies, including sensitive areas such as the annexation of Crimea or the 2022 military operations in Ukraine. Commentators cite sermons and public addresses in which Kirill emphasizes Russian historical unity and warns against Western secularization influences, message that dovetails with Kremlin narratives. Critics argue that consistent public support looks like alignment, if not coordination. Then there's the visible institutional proximity. Kirill's enthronement and major public events have been attended by top Kremlin figures. The Church under his leadership has restored public influence and institutional privileges, often in cooperation with state authorities. For observers, the frequent, cordial public encounters between Kirill and Putin feed the perception of a special relationship. Then there's the policy convergence on ideology. The Church has supported or not opposed laws and state policies that critics see as illiberal. For example, laws promoting traditional values or restrictions on non government organizations. When a church hierarchy repeatedly aligns with the state on such policies, it strengthens the impression of political alliance. And then there's the historical and institutional embeddedness. Given how the Russian state assumes the role of patron of orthodoxy and projects Russia as a civilizational power, critics argue that contemporary church easily becomes an arm of state soft power, whether designed or by the gravitational pull of reciprocal interest. Put these pieces together, and many commentators, particularly in the Western media, conclude the patriarch is, at a minimum, an ally, and at worst, effectively, an instrument of Kremlin policy. And of course, there's a counter argument why control is an oversimplification. So now let's look at the other side. Why saying Kirill is controlled by Putin stretches the facts. First, there's the canonical and institutional constraints. The patriarch's authority, while strong, is still embedded in synodal structures, diocesan bishops, monastic communities, and a broad, often fractious clergy and laity. Changes of doctrine or sweeping ecclesial decisions require wider consent or risk internal resistance. That is not the same environment as a presidential office. In short, the church cannot be run like a presidential office without damaging its own internal legitimacy. And then there's Kirill's own institutional history and networks. Kirill led the Department of External Church Relations for 20 years. That role made him an experienced church diplomat and an ecclesiastical bureaucrat as much as it made him a Kremlin ally. He has independent clergy networks, international relationships, and institutional interests, like monasteries, seminaries, missions, that create structural incentives to act with ecclesiastical logic, not simply political calculation. And he has agency, and there have been occasional divergence. On specific occasions, the Church and Patriarch have taken positions or pursued initiatives that were not simple Kremlin talking points. Social ministries, charitable work, and certain pastoral emphases that respond to parish realities rather than state orders. Institutional actors with long histories tend to pursue their own priorities even while cooperating with the state. You can see this in the Russian Orthodox Church's global liturgical and diplomatic engagements. And there are complex motives beyond obedience. Motivation can include patriotism, a conviction about Russia's civilizational role, an institutional survival strategy, remnant of Soviet experience, genuine theological positions, and pastoral calculation about what keeps the church functioning in a challenging environment. Those motives are not identical to being controlled. So, yes, Kirill's public posture is aligned with the Kremlin on many major political questions, but alignment is not the same as control. Now, let's turn to a little known but virtually important part of Orthodox history, the so-called parallel synod, or sometimes called the Danilov Synod. This episode unfolded during one of the darkest periods for the Russian Orthodox Church, the early years of Soviet rule. Understanding it helps us to see why patriarchs like Kirill face such complex choices even today when navigating between spiritual integrity, and state power. When the Bolsheviks seized control in 1917, they declared war on organized religion. Churches were closed or confiscated, clergy arrested, and believers persecuted. Patriarch Kirill, who had only been restored as patriarch in 1917 after 2 centuries without one, was immediately placed under immense pressure. His communications were censored, and by 1922, he was under house arrest. The Soviet secret police, at the time called the GPU, sought to control the church by creating legal hierarchs who would cooperate with the state. One of these groups became known as the Living Church, or Renovationists, which claimed to modernize the church, but really functioned as a state tool to break traditional orthodoxy. Amid this chaos, a number of bishops loyal to Patriarch Kirill decided they could not allow the legitimate church to be silenced or hijacked. In 1923 through 24, with Patriarch Kirill still under severe restrictions, several prominent bishops gathered secretly at the Danilov Monastery in Moscow, the same monastery that centuries earlier had housed patriarchal offices. This gathering became known as the Parallel Synod. It was not formal, canonical replacement for the official synod, but rather a shadow administration that existed with the tacit blessing of Patriarch Kirill himself, who knew the official synod was under GPU surveillance and coercion. Their goal was simple yet profound: to preserve the continuity of legitimate Orthodox authority, to ensure that new bishops and priests could still be ordained, and to prevent the church from being absorbed by the Soviet machine. The Parallel Synod included some of the most courageous hierarchs of their time. Archbishop Theodore, the organizer and moral leader of the group. Archbishop Andrew, known for his theological clarity and deep devotion. Bishop Arseny, the spiritual father to many of the future new martyrs. Bishop Seraphin, known for his asceticism and prophetic preaching. Bishop Gorius, who provided pastoral leadership to the underground faithful. Also significant later on, figures like Archbishop Seraphin of Uglich were influenced by their principles. The Parallel Synod adopted several crucial resolutions. Decentralization of church life. To prevent total control from a single compromised body, each bishop was encouraged to shepherd his flock locally, even in secret if necessary. Secret consecrations and ordinations, ensuring the church's apostolic succession would not be broken, even if all public institutions were shut down. Preservation of canonical integrity. They refused to recognize the state-backed renovationist hierarchy or any clergy who collaborated with the GPU. Preparation for a future free council. They saw themselves as a temporary measure, holding the line until the church could gather freely again to govern itself. In essence, they believed that obedience to Christ and the canons took precedence over obedience to a government claiming authority over the soul. The cost was staggering. Nearly all the bishops involved in the Parallel Synod were arrested, exiled, or executed in the purges that followed. Their names appear among the thousands of new martyrs and confessors of Russia, canonized in the year 2000 by the Russian Orthodox Church. For them, the church was not a department of the state, it was the body of Christ, independent in its divine mission, even if it meant imprisonment or death. So why does this matter in a discussion about Patriarch Kirill and Putin? Because the legacy of the Parallel Synod still shapes how the Russian church understands itself in relation to the state. Some clergy and believers today see Kirill's cooperation with the Kremlin as a tragic repetition of the compromises of the past. Others, however, argue that the Church learned through persecution that outright confrontation with the state can destroy its ability to minister to millions, and that measured cooperation can sometimes protect the Church's existence. That tension between survival and prophetic witness has never fully disappeared from Russian Orthodoxy. The memory of Danilov's underground bishops whispers in every debate about whether the Church today is too close to political power. So when we ask whether Patriarch Kirill is controlled by Putin, it helps to remember this. For much of the 20th century, every patriarch of Moscow faced the question of how to maintain the Church's freedom under political dominance. The parallel synod shows that resistance can take many forms: public, hidden, or even administrative. And the Church's survival through that period gives context for why modern patriarchs may appear cautious, diplomatic, or aligned with power. They are still living with the scars of that history. When we ask whether Patriarch Kirill is being controlled by President Putin, we should remember this question is not new in Russian history. The tension between church and state has tested nearly every patriarch of Moscow since the 1600s. Some resisted, some compromised, a few were removed altogether. In the mid 1600s, Patriarch Nikon tried to purify Russian worship, correcting service books, unifying practices, and asserting that the patriarch's spiritual authority was equal, if not greater, than the czar's. Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich saw this as an overreach. A church council in 1666, backed by the Tsar, deposed Nikon for abandoning his duties. He was sent into exile, his reforms kept, but his power gone. It was a warning: cross the throne too far, and the mitre could fall. When Nikon's successor, Patriarch Adrian, died in 1700, Peter the Great refused to allow another election. He replaced the Patriarch with a holy governing Synod, a kind of ministry of religion under state control. For more than 2 centuries, from 1700 to 1917, there was no Patriarch of Moscow. The Church became part of the imperial bureaucracy. It ministered to millions, yes, but it had lost its independence. When the Patriarchate was finally restored in 1917, the new Patriarch Tikhon faced an even harsher ruler, the Bolsheviks. He condemned bloodshed, excommunication of looters, and attacks on the church. For that, he was arrested, stripped of power, and confined to his house. The government tried to replace him with a fake living church loyal to Lenin. Tikhon was later released, but the message was clear: the Soviet state tolerated faith only on its own terms. Then came Patriarch Sergius. After years of terror, he issued a 1927 declaration pledging loyalty to Stalin's regime, hoping to protect what was left of the church. Many saw it as betrayal. Underground bishops formed a catacomb church and refused to recognize him. Sergius wasn't deposed, but his name became synonymous with the painful compromises of survival. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Patriarch Alexei II rebuilt the church from ruins. Thousands of churches reopened, seminaries revived, and the faith returned to public life. But his closeness to the Kremlin drew criticism. Was he truly free? The same question now faces Patriarch Kirill. Yet, unlike Nikon, he hasn't challenged state authority. Unlike Tikhon, he hasn't been imprisoned. And unlike Sergius, he hasn't been replaced by a rival hierarchy. What we see instead is a patriarch working within the framework of Russian tradition, one that has long seen cooperation between church and ruler not as servitude, but as symphonia, harmony of purpose. So, has the patriarch ever been controlled by the state? Yes, sometimes brutally. But other times, he has used his position to temper power with conscience and to keep faith alive in dark times. Patriarch Kirill stands in that same tension. Whether you see him as complicit or cautious depends on how you read that history. Because in Russia, the line between altar and throne has never been a wall, only a fragile bridge. When people today hear that Patriarch Kirill appears close to President Putin, it's easy to imagine this as something new, as if the church has suddenly become political. But in truth, the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority in Russia has always been deeply intertwined. Sometimes that relationship has been corrupted, yes, but other times, and this is important, it has produced profound good. Let's look at how the balance between the czar and the patriarch has worked for the benefit of the people throughout history. From the beginning, Orthodox Christianity taught a principle known as symphonia, the harmony between spiritual and secular power. This idea was laid out in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian and became the guiding model for Orthodox nations. In this view, the emperor or czar was not a rival to a church, but a co worker with it, each ordained by God, one to govern the body, the other to shepherd the soul. That vision shaped the Russian mind. It meant that the czar's legitimacy depended upon upholding Orthodox faith, and the patriarch's spiritual authority had national, even civil importance. When these two powers worked in concert, Russia flourished spiritually, culturally, and socially. Let's begin in the early 1600s, during what's called the Time of Troubles, a period of foreign invasions, famine, and civil war following the fall of the Rurik dynasty. It was Patriarch Hermogenes of Moscow who became the moral backbone of the Russian people. He refused to recognize foreign imposed rulers and called on the nation to rise up in defense of orthodoxy and independence. His letters inspired the volunteer armies of Minin and Pozarsky, who eventually liberated Moscow in 1612. Hermogenes died a martyr, starved in prison for refusing to submit to Polish occupiers, but his faith laid the foundation for the restoration of the Russian state. When the 16-year-old Michael Romanov was elected Tsar in 1613, it was the church, led by the patriarch, that legitimized his role. That cooperation between altar and throne brought stability and unity to a devastated nation. Another example comes from the reign of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich and Patriarch Nikon in the mid 1600s. Together, they envisioned a deeply Christian society, one in which governance was not secular but morally accountable to the gospel. Nikon worked to reform liturgical books and unify Orthodox worship across the empire, ensuring the faith remained doctrinally sound. While their relationship eventually soured over questions of authority, Nikon asserting spiritual independence from the Tsar, their collaboration marked a golden moment in the development of Russian religious identity. Under Alexei and Nikon, churches were built, theological schools founded, and the moral reform of society encouraged. It was imperfect, yes, but it demonstrated the power of partnership between the throne and the altar when guided by conscience and faith. Now, not all cooperation looked like harmony. Under Peter the Great, the office of patriarch was abolished and the church was governed instead by the Holy Synod, a kind of ecclesiastical council under imperial supervision. Many modern critics call this the beginning of state control over the church. But even here, we should note that Peter's intention wasn't to destroy orthodoxy. It was to modernize the Russian Empire, making it capable of surviving in a rapidly changing European world. Peter believed religion should serve the moral and civic formation of the people. He reformed seminaries, improved clergy education, and promoted literacy. The cost, of course, was independence, but the church continued to minister to millions and to shape the Russian soul. Even in this tension, there was a sense of shared purpose, that the church and the czar both existed to protect and uplift the people. In the 1800s, during the reigns of Tsars Alexander I, Nicholas I, and Alexander II, this partnership took a new form, a moral and national vision. Orthodoxy was seen as the soul of the Russian nation. During the Napoleonic Wars, priests blessed the armies and encouraged the defense of the fatherland. In the post-war years, the church led vast charitable networks, orphanages, hospitals, and schools, long before the state had social services. Alexander II, who freed the serfs in 1861, did so under the influence of a strong Christian conscience, cultivated in part by his chaplains and the church's teaching about human dignity. In many ways, the Tsar and the Patriarch were seen as two hands of the same national body, one temporal, one eternal. So, what does this history tell us? That church state cooperation in Russia has always been a double edged sword. It can corrupt, yes, but it can also heal. When the Tsar or the president seeks merely to use religion as a political tool, the result is spiritual decline. But when the church works alongside temporal power for the good of the people to preserve peace, support families, defend faith, and promote moral revival, that's not compromise. That's symphonia. That's the ancient Orthodox vision of how heaven and earth can work together. Patriarch Kirill stands in this long and complicated tradition. He is not a political pawn, but a man walking a difficult path, balancing the church's prophetic mission with her historical responsibility to the Russian nation. So where does that leave us on the question? Is Patriarch Kirill controlled by Putin? Here's a careful synthesis. Yes, there is strong empirical evidence of close alignment between Kirill's public posture and the Kremlin's policies. He is a visible ally of the contemporary Russian state, and the church has benefited institutionally from that proximity. Reporting and analysis from multiple outlets document these overlaps. But control as a simple causal claim is too blunt. Kirill is the head of a vast institution with its own logic, constituencies, international contacts, and canonical limits. He has agency, institutional incentives, pastoral obligations, and ecclesiastical networks that mediate how he acts. The Church's Soviet history, including parallel and underground responses, shows that survival strategies are complex and sometimes ambiguous. Put another way, Kirill is very close to Putin, politically aligned in many public ways, but that is not synonymous with being a passive puppet. Close cooperation can be voluntary, strategic, patriotic, or coerced in different degrees. The evidence supports a conclusion of strategic alignment and mutual utility, rather than a simple one-to-one control relationship. My opinion kind of reflects this belief. I think the stronger, more defensible claim is that Patriarch Kirill acts as a powerful institutional partner of the Russian state who shares many political convictions with the Kremlin and calculates that cooperation protects and advances the Church's interests. This is different from saying he is directly controlled by Putin's office like an appointee on a leash. The difference matters, especially when we are thinking about responsibility, conscience, and the internal dynamics of the Church. Thank you for watching this video. This is a complicated, sensitive topic because it mixes theology, church history, and geopolitics. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe. I'd appreciate it. A little subscribe button right down there. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you see Kirill as a willing partner, a reluctant collaborator, or a man who walks an impossible line? Drop a comment and let's discuss with clarity and curiosity. Glory to God for all things. Memory eternal to those who suffered for the faith. Thank you for watching and have yourself a blessed day.